HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Users by Colin Winnette. Read by Justin Price. Part 1. The Beginning. 1. Your heart will stop. Miles was getting death threats. So far, fewer than he would have liked. Not that he wanted to be getting death threats, but once he started seeing them for what they were, he felt like having a few more from a few more people would somehow be less threatening. Technically, this first one wasn't the first. It was the first he'd noticed, the first he'd recognized as a legitimate death threat. Soon. That was all the real first threat had said. He was sure he wasn't alone in his capacity to misinterpret the message. It was only a word, and words came alive in context. They relied on one another, the difference between a log and a log cabin. Your heart will stop. The messages were letterpressed on weighted stationery, not tossed off online in a fit of pique. There was no postmark on either envelope, no return address. Someone had spent time, actual money. They had carried the notes to his home, slid them in the mail slot, and left. When Miles's daughters arrived home from school to find him staring at the refrigerator, they absently asked about the new artwork mounted to its door. "It's a reminder," he told them, "a note to myself." "It's pretty," said his 6-year-old, fingering the edge of the cream-colored paper. Miles had placed a kitchen magnet on the bottom half of the threat, so the top half became a flap that could conceal or reveal the message with a touch. He guided his daughter's hand from the flap before she could lift it. But she was right. It was pretty. The quality of the stationery was part of the reason he'd overlooked the first threat. Soon. Seeing the envelope, he'd mistaken it for a wedding invitation. Opening it, he'd amended the mistake, guessing it was advance notice for a forthcoming save-the-date. Your heart will stop. There was no longer room for misinterpretation. Soon, finally, had a context. Soon was when his heart would stop. 2. Miles's wife came home late, as she'd been doing more and more often. She found Miles in the kitchen, still staring at the folded note on the refrigerator door. "I'm tired," she said, hanging her purse from a chair back and immediately beginning to undress. "What would you do if someone killed me?" he said. "If who killed you?" she said. "Anyone," he said. "Honestly," she said, "it would depend on the person, how and why they did it." "That's it," he said. "That's all you've given me," she said, vanishing down the dark hall. Miles stared at the threat for a moment before calling after her. "You're saying there's a version where you'd have no reaction at all?" "That's not what I'm saying," she called back. "I'm saying the reaction would be different, depending on those things." Miles got up and followed his wife into the bedroom, where he could hear her fiddling with a drawer. "What's an example of a possible reaction, then?" he said, hypothetically. "I already told you," she said. She slid the drawer shut. "I'd need all the variables." Before tonight, Miles had made a project of letting go. He'd been trying to live more in the moment, to accept things as they came. While he rejected mindfulness as a practice, he still allowed himself to deploy certain mindful strategies when convenient. But now Miles was mindful only of the threat. He spent most of the night in the kitchen with it, realizing again and again that it was still there, still real, still a death threat. Soon. A moment of self-doubt sent him digging through the trash for the first note. He was no longer sure he remembered it correctly. Was that really all it said? He knew the search was futile. How many times had they taken out the trash in the last few days? but he couldn't not check after having had the thought. If the note was still there, he wanted to know. He wanted to be certain. He wanted to consider both notes at the same time, see them for exactly what they were, and understand exactly how they were working together to make him feel the way he was feeling. Miles felt afraid. He felt uncertain. He felt like there was something he should be doing to stop all this, but he had not figured it out yet. Miles's hand came out of the trash can's liner with nothing but a yellow grain of rice stuck under his nail. His best guess was the Mediterranean they'd ordered weeks ago. They'd taken out the trash countless times since then, and the goddamn grains of rice were still showing up. He rinsed his hands and gave up on the trash. Miles was irritable. It was almost 2 a.m. When Miles found he couldn't sleep, he searched online for a database of toll-free hotlines offering sympathetic ears to those experiencing harassment or abuse. He wasn't comfortable labeling the 2 letters he'd received on expensive stationery harassment or abuse, but it felt astute to recognize these letters might prefigure harassment or abuse of some kind, and he wanted to be ready. Minutes later, a young operator was telling him that fear and frustration were completely valid and natural feelings. "It might comfort you to know," she said, "that the statistical likelihood of anyone following through on a written threat is low. Even so, I understand why you can't help but take them seriously. Unfortunately, legal recourse is limited in situations like these, at least at this stage. Even if the author of the notes were to show up, the options available to you would depend on how that person acted, what they said and did. The truth is, you'll have to wait and see, though I imagine that's less comforting than you'd like it to be." She sounded young to Miles, far too young for her to be so well-versed in death threat best practices, but something in her short life so far had led her to become an expert at navigating situations Miles had only just been introduced to, not conceptually, but personally, and that even he could acknowledge he wasn't handling particularly well. It didn't seem fair. "You're sure you don't know who could be sending them?" she said. "Like who?" he said. "I don't know anyone like that." "Of course," she said. She waited a moment before continuing. "The source may become clear with time, or it may not, but I can tell you from experience that in the meantime you'll swing between worry, forgetting, frustration, anger, depression. It's normal. It's valid. If it's any consolation, in the grand scheme of things, what you're dealing with is relatively minor." It wasn't much of a consolation. If anything, Miles felt demoted, but at least according to a professional, his situation wasn't urgent. If it wasn't an emergency, that meant his inaction so far may well have been the best possible response. Somehow, instinctively, he'd gotten it right. "You're right," he said. "You must hear so much worse." The operator laughed, then caught herself and folded the sound into an abrupt clearing of her throat. But it was too late. In that brief and vulnerable moment, Miles caught a glimpse of unknown depths, and he was suddenly gripped by the need to hear every detail she had to offer from her years of experience on the job, every story from every call that would put his situation in perspective, tip the scales and sort the unwieldy card he'd been dealt back into the deck of relative normalcy. "Unfortunately," she said, having replaced all discernible candor with an affected neutrality, likely the product of some weekend orientation. "Unfortunately, these situations do escalate. Not always, and typically when they do there are precipitating incidents, a breakup, a fight, a restraining order. But in the absence of those things, anonymous letters are rarely acted on. They often cease as abruptly as they start. For your purposes, it's best to assume they mean nothing until you have reason to think otherwise." Miles tried to imagine what those reasons to think otherwise might be, but the second the images began to populate his mind, he banished them. "So it could get worse," he said, "but there's nothing I can do about it, nothing I should do, no way to prepare. That's what you're saying? I just want to be clear. I do nothing about the death threats." "For now," she said, "the best thing is to focus on your daily life. Try not to let the anxiety this is causing you take over. Do you meditate? If not, try it. Try focusing on what's in front of you as you move through the day, one thing at a time. With any luck, this will all be over soon." It was a sober script prepared off-mic, written specifically to handle people like Miles, people who were not used to the idea of looming violence, of inevitable violence, of other humans in the world who would like to harm, specifically, them. "If you're worried, and you can afford it," she said, without the slightest hint of discovery in her voice, "you might invest in a security system. Lock your doors, stay vigilant, but in all likelihood, nothing will come of the notes." More than frightening, it was unsatisfying, the notion that the best course of action was to continue resisting action at all. While he was happy to have been right in his instinct so far, it didn't seem like a viable, long-term strategy to continue doing nothing. Miles liked to think of himself as capable of this kind of rational and detached problem-solving, but these were death threats. Maybe things wouldn't progress, but if they did, it was hard to imagine them progressing in any way other than the stated design, an undesirable outcome in the face of which Miles would feel foolish to have done nothing preventive. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, as she began her sign-off spiel. "Remember, we're always here. I don't mean to keep you. I'm just having trouble wrapping my head around the idea of how exactly one does nothing. If I sit and wait, as you're suggesting, aren't I simply handing the situation over to my would-be assailant, rather than actively working to determine my fate?" The operator was slow to answer, flipping pages in some laminated manual, no doubt, or mentally preparing herself to spend another hour looping back through responses to the same concerns Miles had been approaching from different angles for the past hour. Hearing her hesitation, he felt guilty for leaning on her. This young woman wasn't even getting paid to answer calls like his, to talk strangers like him through their preliminary responses to anonymous threats, general harassment, persistent stalkers, life-shattering assaults, whatever worse meant. She must have lived through something unimaginable to want to spend her nights telling people it was normal, understandable even, to be afraid all the time. According to her, it was supposed to be a comforting thought, the standard validity of his fear. Maybe the more you said these things, the easier they were to accept as true. Or maybe they simply were true, and some people had no choice but to know that and work from there. "You're not keeping me," she said. "And no, I'm not talking about doing nothing. I'm talking about doing the work of trying to find your way back to the parts of your life that make you happy, acknowledging and accepting the fact that there are other parts you can't control." "And I'll feel better," said Miles, "once I've done that." "Some days will be harder than others," she said. "Some days will be easier. In either case, we're always here." He understood they'd yet again reached the end of the loop, but he didn't feel finished. He wasn't ready to be alone. Still, his options were few. Start it all over again, or let her go. "Okay," he said. "It's frustrating," she said. "I know. That's a completely natural and valid way to feel. It might comfort you to know that the statistical likelihood of anyone following through on a written threat is very low. In all likelihood, none of this will feel all that important to you in a matter of time. You'll have other things to worry about, to focus on. If that turns out to not be the case, we're always here." Miles washed his hands, took out the garbage, and washed his hands again. In bed, he could smell the cubes of lamb that had nested on the rice maybe 2 weeks prior. He kept his hands at his sides, pushing them deep under the covers, as far from his nose as he could get them. The smell remained. It seemed to fill the room. All that, thought Miles, from a single grain of rice. 3. The note was still on the fridge in the morning. Some part of Miles had hoped it wouldn't be. Not that it would have vanished in the night, that was too creepy, but that it would never have been there in the first place, that it was a dream or a vision delivered upon him in the throes of a fit of insomnia. Everyone else was energized by a good night's sleep. His 6-year-old was drawing lines through the salt she'd spilled on the table, and his 10-year-old was at the stove, announcing she'd be making breakfast for the family. "Pancakes," she said, fiddling with the knob for the burner. She was occupying herself by turning it past the quick flick of the igniter, pumping a spurt of gas into the room, then quickly turning it back to off. "There's no time for cleanup," said his wife. "Honey, move." He was at the fridge door, blocking it. He'd meant to open it. For what, he couldn't remember now. But he'd become sidetracked by the note yet again. For several minutes he'd been standing there, lifting the flap to read the message, then letting the top half fall back into place. "Sorry," he said. He stepped aside so his wife could get water from the filter. "What is that?" she said, pointing at the paper. "A death threat," he said. "Funny," she said. She slid a carton of fat brown eggs from the bottom shelf and turned. "How many eggs can you fry in 10 minutes? Across the room, his 10-year-old was grinning like a maniac. "I could fry them all," she said. 4. At work, Miles had a different problem. Their user community was in revolt. "It's the fucking ghost lover," said Lily, the only person in the office speaking above a whisper. His other co-workers were at their desks, working quietly, an alarming start to any day. Miles knew from years of working at the company that the calmer the place seemed when he arrived, the worse and farther reaching the underlying issue. "The nerds are up in arms about it," Lily said. She followed Miles into the office kitchen as he sped through his morning routine, preparing himself for the shitstorm headed his way. "They're claiming it breaks our code of conduct." Thursdays were normally no-meeting days, and Miles had gone in planning to catch up on all the small projects he'd previously set aside in favor of short conversations that would inevitably run long about larger projects he ultimately had nothing to do with. One quick glance at his calendar, however, revealed it was already clogged with meeting requests, starting 30 minutes before he'd arrived and running through the end of the day. "We don't have a code of conduct," said Miles, pumping half a cup of pure cream into his coffee from a refrigerated bag. "Right?" "Not for our stuff," she said, "but we've been deleting user experiences." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh, fuck off," said Lily. "I'm talking about racist shit, sexist shit. Users are building fucking rape dungeons, Miles. We shouldn't need a code of conduct to justify banning that shit." "I didn't say anything," he said, heading back to his desk. "That was a shitload of cream," said Lily, keeping pace. Lily was right about the cream. It was a shitload. But lately, a shitload was the bare minimum required to get Miles through each morning and into the first part of his day. His shirts were getting tighter. When he turned and pinched himself in front of the mirror, there was a line of fat developing at the base of his back, like the inflatable bumpers at a bowling alley. He knew it was an indulgence, and one in which he partook too often to justify his self-care, but his resolve to curb the impulse routinely collapsed under the recognition that the cream was the only reliable source of pleasure available to him on any given day. He looked forward to it. He missed it when he didn't have it. Some days he would drink small amounts straight from a cup, provided no one was there to witness him doing it. Either way, the coffee had become secondary. The company had the cream driven in each week from a farm 2 hours north of the city. Miles had fallen in love with it the day they'd visited the farm on a work field trip, an off-site, they'd called it, which made it sound more professional, more productive than the company had any intention of it being. On the drive up, his manager had passed out tiny personal bottles of champagne because, in truth, the offsite was designed to be little more than a display of the luxuries the company could afford to offer its employees while still turning a healthy profit. It was marketing, meant just as much for those who would hopefully hear about it as those who had been forced to attend. The whole thing was absurd without being funny. It was programmatically unhinged, and it had all the subtlety of a third date. Miles had been silently, invisibly averse to the outing from the moment they were loaded onto the black buses, logging all his complaints in the back of his mind for later that night when he would unload them on his wife rapid-fire over wine. But all that changed when a ranch hand in pressed dickies served Miles a dollop of pure cream from a Dixie cup the size of an acorn. The moment he tasted it, his aversion to the trip melted away. The cream was vaguely vegetal, with the fatty lightness of good cake. To Miles it tasted like fresh air, a life without cars. It was the mucus of the gods, and it transformed the burdensome trip into a divine gift in his eyes. Miles sipped the small serving and asked for another, confident the day had reached its peak. Then he was introduced to the source. Moments later, a knot of healthy cows chewing clockwise approached a fence where Miles stood. He reached out, touched one on its wet pink nose. Their names were written in chalk on a tablet hung from a nearby post. Miles called out the name he liked most, Lefty, and a brown cow with a chipped ear lifted its massive anvil of a head to look back at him. "Miles," said Lily, snapping in his face, "where the fuck are you?" Miles had been staring open-mouthed into the middle of the room, fiddling with the bottom jaw of a Godzilla head someone had left on his desk overnight. He checked its mouth for a death threat, then wondered if the head itself was the threat. "Sorry," he said. He shoved his hands into his pockets and tried to remember what they were talking about. "We didn't see any of this coming," he said. "I think we underestimated how mad they'd be when we shut down the fucking rape dungeons," she said, "and how organized." "Right. Dream it and it's yours," he said. "Dream it and it's yours," she said. They'd group-tested the slogan for weeks, but everyone had known it was the one the moment it slid out of an intern's mouth. Dream it and it's yours. What better way to position a virtual reality company that put you, the user, in the creative driver's seat? More than simple interactivity, users had control over their environment entirely, from start to finish. Every reproducible element, at least. It was a living fantasy, limited only by the speed of your internet and the company's servers. The only trouble, or the first sign of trouble when they were just getting started, was that users seemed to have impoverished dreams. Rather than flying over the Grand Canyon, dropping water balloons on ex-presidents, they were building experiences for themselves that consisted primarily of things they could already do in the real world, sitting in a bathtub at home, petting their cat, eating dinner with a faceless pack of abs, or, a real stretch, shopping with a celebrity. The problem was that users were boring more than the company with these outings. They were boring themselves. They weren't coming back to the platform, and when they did, they were staying for less and less time. And the less time users spent on the platform, the less valuable the platform was to shareholders, advertisers, and potential investors. To survive, the company needed users to stay put, to keep dreaming. But as it turned out, the unlimited possibilities of their dreams weren't enough to keep the average person's attention for very long. The early days of the platform had shown the company how hard it was for most users to dive headfirst into their own imaginations, to independently sustain an engaging and prolonged projection for long enough to keep the company afloat. To do that, the users needed a boost, a little nudge toward the deep end. They needed a place to start. The company hit pay dirt when they began releasing their own content, designed in-house. Alternative realities sounded too dystopian, because each was only meant to be a jumping-off point, not the destination. They were more like the on button for a dream, or a drug that invites the hallucination, then hands over the reins. After months of user testing, the company landed on the name Original Experiences. The Ghost Lover was the company's most popular original experience by far. In it, you were you, in your apartment or home, with things almost exactly as they were in your daily life, only you were being haunted by the ghost of an ex-lover. The experience was designed to create the feeling that the haunting was deeply personal, that your specific ghost lover was entirely your own, built from your life experiences, tailored to your tastes and behavior. There was a massive onboarding process to help achieve this effect, but the onboarding process itself was part of the deception. The company had learned that asking a series of penetrating personal questions before a user began would grant a generic ghost the air of specificity. The more broadly the ghost behaved, the more room was left for users to project onto it, and the more time a user sank into answering questions about their ghost, the more generous their interpretations of its broad behavior would be. It was an easy trick, and one the company had learned early on, thanks again to user testing. The less specific the company was in its design, the more specifically tailored users seemed to think the experience was. Again, it wasn't that users didn't have imaginations. Their imaginations needed help. There was a flood of creativity after the first wave of OEs hit. Daily users almost doubled, and the community library shelves were soon bloated with strange new user-generated experiences. There was something almost confessional about them. Memories were a common model, monumental moments in a user's life. The dreams spun out from there. Increasingly, the new experiences took on the qualities of fantasy, merging elements of real life with the impossible logic of the subconscious. These were the roadmaps the company had been hoping to access all along, the extra-rational, the indescribably personal, some key that could help unlock the cognitive processes behind the construction of a fantasy, the cultivation of unchecked want, pure desire. As it turned out, the key had been little more than suggestion. To act as free as they truly were, users needed something to riff on, an example of what was possible. They needed to know what it could look like, and they needed something external, something beyond themselves to confirm that the choices they'd made were of consequence. Once they were hooked, each user became a derrick, spewing the oil of good, reliable, marketable data. "What's a rape dungeon got to do with the ghost lover?" said Miles. "It's a consent issue," said Lily. "What's that mean?" said Miles. "You might want to workshop that before the hearings," said Lily. Miles tried to remember what happened in The Ghost Lover. There were some opportunities for dancing in the later chapters, but they'd never gone full porno with it. In fact, that was what set them apart from almost every other leading virtual reality company out there, though the absence of explicit sexual content was far from a puritanical effort on the company's part. As they saw it, the proposition of sex overpowered the operating systems behind an individual's natural dream construction. "A bush in the hand beats imagining birds," was how one of the finance guys explained it at parties. Despite its title, The Ghost Lover had never been about sex. Originally, Miles had wanted to make a melancholic experience, something internal, a curiously infinite navel. He'd pulled the idea together over a long weekend while his wife and kids were in the desert taking photos of nightmare bugs and glittering rock formations. Miles had been waking up each night to the sound of thumps in his wall, like someone nearby was struggling to move furniture. The sound was always the same, too regular to be incidental, but too inconsistent to be something like a washing machine. Maybe it was the fact that he hadn't been alone for more than a night since his second daughter was born, but he hadn't been able to shake the feeling that the source of the thumps was supernatural, like something from beyond was trying to use the wall to communicate with him. It was a ridiculous idea, but it had lodged itself in his mind. Alone with his feet.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?